I remember the day I first held my children in my arms as if it happened yesterday. The overwhelming feeling of love and responsibility washed over me, a mixture of joy, fear, and an unshakable commitment that would define the rest of my life. I had no idea then that my love would one day be questioned, that the very people I raised with care and devotion might reject me simply because of a misconception about my financial situation. But life, as I would later learn, has a cruel way of testing even the strongest bonds. From the moment they were born, I vowed that I would provide them with everything they needed, not just materially but emotionally. I worked tirelessly, often late into the night, to ensure that they had a roof over their heads, clothes on their backs, and food on the table. I remember skipping meals myself, delaying my own comfort, just to make sure that my children never wanted for anything. And yet, even in those early years, there were whispers of doubt, small comments from acquaintances questioning whether I could truly give them a good life. I ignored them, focusing on my mission, to raise my children with love, kindness, and a sense of morality that I hoped would guide them throughout their lives. As they grew older, I watched with pride as my children reached milestones, each one a reminder of the sacrifices I had made. Their first steps, their first words, the first day of school, all of it was etched in my memory. I celebrated every achievement, no matter how small, and comforted them through every disappointment. My life revolved around their happiness, and I never considered whether my own dreams or desires were being put aside. In my mind, there was no sacrifice too great when it came to the well-being of my children. But life has a way of testing the limits of our patience and resilience. My husband, a kind but often impractical man, tried to support me as best he could, but he struggled with financial consistency. We had our fair share of hardship, times when bills piled up, when unexpected expenses threatened our stability. During those periods, I learned the true meaning of frugality, of finding joy in the simplest things, of making a little stretch to meet a lot. I became an expert at budgeting, at making meals that felt luxurious even when ingredients were simple, at creating moments of happiness that didn't cost a dime. Despite the financial struggles, I never let my children feel the weight of our circumstances. I told them stories of hope, of hard work, of resilience. I taught them that life was not about wealth, but about character, integrity, and love. I wanted them to grow up understanding that true success was measured not by what you owned, but by how you treated others and how you faced challenges. And for a time, it seemed as though my lessons were taking root. My eldest, Emily, was always the most outspoken. She had a fiery spirit, a determination that both impressed and exhausted me. She was brilliant in school, curious about the world, and ambitious in her dreams. I encouraged her to pursue her passions, to aim high, and to believe in herself. My son, Michael, was quieter, more introspective, but just as driven in his own way. He loved numbers and logic, and I often found myself marveling at his analytical mind. And my youngest, Sophie, was the dreamer, the artist, the one who found beauty in the world in ways that left me speechless. Each child was unique, and I cherished their individuality, nurturing their talents and interests with all the energy I could muster. Over the years, I became adept at managing our household, at finding ways to make ends meet even when resources were tight. I took on extra work when necessary, picking up shifts, tutoring, and occasionally doing freelance jobs that no one outside our home would know about. I rarely spoke of these efforts to my children, not because I wanted recognition, but because I wanted them to focus on their growth and education without feeling burdened by my struggles. I believed that my role as a parent was to bear the weight of the world so they could walk freely without worry, and for many years it seemed to work. My children thrived. They excelled in school, made friends easily, and pursued their hobbies with vigor. I watched their lives unfold with pride and a sense of quiet satisfaction. They were happy, and that was all that mattered to me. I never sought validation, never desired applause for my sacrifices. Their smiles, their laughter, and their small victories were the only rewards I needed. But as they grew older, subtle changes began to emerge. The first signs were small, almost imperceptible. Emily, now a teenager, began making comments about money, about what she deserved versus what she had. Michael started asking questions about financial security, in ways that felt different from his usual curiosity. Sophie, always the sensitive one, began expressing feelings of envy when she saw other children with things we couldn't provide. At first, I dismissed these remarks as typical teenage concerns, as fleeting thoughts of young minds exploring the world. But deep down, I sensed that a shift was occurring, a subtle but undeniable change in their perceptions. It became more pronounced as Emily approached adulthood. She started comparing herself to peers, measuring her life against theirs. She made comments about what she wanted in the future, often framing it in terms of money and material comfort. I tried to guide her gently, to remind her that wealth was not the measure of a person, but she seemed increasingly influenced by the culture around her. Michael, too, began to express similar sentiments, focusing on career paths that promised financial gain over passion or fulfillment. Sophie, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile her artistic dreams with the practical realities she saw in her siblings' priorities. Despite these growing tensions, I continued to love them unconditionally. I never scolded for their changing attitudes. I simply tried to understand, to guide, and to provide wisdom born of experience. I believed that love could overcome any material obsession, that the bonds we had formed over years of shared struggles and joys would remain unbroken. But I was beginning to learn that even the strongest bonds can be tested by perception, by assumptions, and by misunderstandings. The first real test came when Emily entered college. She was offered a scholarship that covered her tuition, but she immediately began talking about the lifestyle she wanted to maintain. She wanted a car, a bigger apartment, and the latest gadgets. I explained that we would help her within reason, but that extravagance was not something we could afford. She protested, arguing that her friends had these things, that she deserved them, and that our modest means were somehow inadequate. Michael and Sophie, observing these interactions, began to echo similar sentiments, subtly reinforcing a narrative that our family was poor or lacking. It was during this period that I began to notice a pattern. My children were equating love and parental care with financial wealth. They had grown up with my sacrifices, my quiet efforts to provide and protect, but somehow, in their minds, those sacrifices were invisible if they did not come with visible signs of wealth. It was a painful realization, one that struck at the very heart of my identity as a parent. How could the people I had nurtured, protected, and sacrificed for fail to see the value of love over money? How could they reduce decades of devotion to a mere assessment of dollars and cents? I tried to address it carefully, having conversations late at night when the house was quiet. I shared stories of my own childhood, of hardships we had endured, of lessons I had learned about character, resilience, and integrity. I reminded them that true wealth was not counted in currency, but in kindness, in courage, and in the ability to overcome adversity. Some days I thought they understood. Other days it seemed as though my words had no impact at all. The tension escalated when Emily announced her engagement. Her fiancé came from a well-to-do family, and almost immediately, our modest lifestyle became a point of contention. His family, accustomed to a certain standard of living, began making subtle remarks about our home, our possessions, and our habits. Emily, influenced by these comments, started to treat me differently. She became dismissive, often questioning my decisions, my spending, and even my intentions. Michael and Sophie, witnessing this shift, began to mirror her behavior. Suddenly, the warm, loving family dynamic we had built over decades was replaced by an undercurrent of judgment, subtle derision, and an unspoken assessment of worth based on money. I remember the first day I realized just how far this had gone. Emily, in a conversation about household expenses, said casually, almost as an aside, "Mom, we don't need this old beggar managing our lives." The words hit me like a physical blow. I froze, unable to speak as the reality sank in. My own child, the one I had raised with love, with sacrifice, with every ounce of my being, had dismissed me because she believed I was poor. My heart ached in a way I had never imagined possible. I wanted to cry, to scream, to explain, but the words caught in my throat. In that moment, I realized that the challenge before me was not about money, not about material possessions, but about restoring the bonds that had been strained by misunderstanding and perception. I knew that I could not control their attitudes, nor could I force them to see the truth. All I could do was remain steadfast, continue to love them unconditionally, and hope that one day the depth of my sacrifices and the authenticity of my love would become undeniable. And so began the next chapter of my life, one filled with quiet determination, strategic patience, and an unwavering commitment to proving that love, integrity, and dedication are worth far more than money. I had no idea how long it would take, or how difficult the journey would be. I only knew that I could not give up, for giving up would mean conceding that the very foundation of our family, the love I had poured into them for decades, was meaningless. Little did I know, the events that followed would test every fiber of my being. They would challenge my patience, my resilience, and my faith in the power of love. They would bring moments of despair, moments of triumph, and moments of revelation that would forever change the way I viewed my family, my sacrifices, and the true meaning of wealth. This was only the beginning. The days following Emily's harsh words felt like a cold shadow had fallen over our home. I moved through the house quietly, pretending to carry on as normal, but every glance, every interaction felt strained. I had spent decades nurturing, guiding, and protecting my children, and now it seemed that the very people I had poured my heart into saw me as little more than an obstacle or a burden. The word beggar echoed in my mind constantly, and I couldn't shake the sting of it. No matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was just a fleeting moment of arrogance on Emily's part, Michael and Sophie began to behave differently as well. Where there had once been laughter and shared confidences, there was now distance. Conversations that used to be filled with warmth became curt and transactional. Michael, who had always been the quiet thinker, now looked at me with subtle impatience, as if my presence itself was inconvenient. Sophie, my sensitive youngest, seemed caught in the middle, unsure whether to side with her siblings or maintain loyalty to me. Each day, I felt a growing chasm between us, a rift that threatened to swallow the decades of love and trust I had built. I tried to reach out, to find small ways to reconnect. I cooked their favorite meals, stayed up late helping with school projects, and made an effort to listen to their concerns without judgment. Yet, each attempt was met with subtle rejection. Emily would brush off my advice, Michael would roll his eyes, and Sophie, though quieter, seemed hesitant to show affection. It was as if all my past sacrifices had been erased in a single judgment of perceived poverty. I realized painfully that my children were now seeing me through a lens of material value rather than emotional connection. The tension reached its peak one afternoon when I overheard Emily talking to her fiancé in the living room. They were discussing our household in a tone that made my stomach churn. "I just don't know how we can trust her with anything," Emily said, gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen where I was preparing lunch. "She's always so old-fashioned, and I mean, look at her finances. I don't think we can rely on her judgment." Her fiancé nodded, saying something I couldn't catch, and I felt an icy wave of realization. My family was questioning my capability, not because I had ever failed, but because they assumed I lacked resources. That night, I cried quietly in my bedroom. I cried not because I had failed as a parent, but because I felt invisible. I had devoted my life to raising my children with love and integrity, and yet they were judging me on assumptions. My husband tried to comfort me, but even he looked weary. He knew the battles we had fought together to raise our family, and he felt the same sting of disappointment at seeing our children dismissive of the values we had tried to instill. In the weeks that followed, the household atmosphere became increasingly strained. Emily began making decisions without consulting me, assuming that I would simply comply with whatever she wanted. She demanded financial contributions for her personal expenses, seemingly blind to the fact that our household had limited resources and that I was already stretching every dollar to ensure their needs were met. Michael started taking on a similar role, making subtle demands and questioning my decisions regarding money, meals, and household arrangements. Sophie remained silent, often retreating to her room for hours, avoiding confrontation, yet clearly affected by the tension. It was during this period that I began to reflect deeply on my parenting approach. Had I failed to prepare my children for the realities of life? Had I been too protective, too accommodating, or too focused on their immediate happiness to instill a true understanding of values? Questions haunted me late at night when the house was silent and only the sound of my own thoughts filled the room. I knew that love alone could not shield them from the world's material obsessions, but I had hoped that my example, my sacrifices, and my teachings would provide a moral compass. Clearly, the lesson had not landed as I had intended. The first major confrontation came unexpectedly. Emily, frustrated with a minor household rule, exploded in anger. "Why do we have to live like this?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusing. "Why can't you be more normal? Everyone else has money, comfort, security. Why are you holding us back?" Michael chimed in, echoing her sentiments. Sophie, silent but visibly uncomfortable, watched from the doorway, her eyes wide with unease. I stood there, stunned. For a moment, I couldn't find words, my heart heavy with disbelief. The children I had nurtured, guided, and sacrificed for were now attacking me, not because of mistakes I had made, but because of their perception of my financial worth. I tried to respond calmly. "I have always done everything I could to provide for you, to give you love, care, and guidance," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I have worked hard, often silently, to make sure your needs were met. My worth as a parent is not determined by money, but by love, dedication, and the sacrifices I've made for you." Emily scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "Love doesn't pay for things we need, Mom. Love doesn't give us the life everyone else has. You don't understand what it's like out here." Her words pierced me deeper than any argument ever could. I realized then that my children had begun equating love with material provision. They had come to believe that my inability, or as they perceived it, unwillingness, to provide wealth was equivalent to a lack of care. And worse, they were beginning to forget all the years of effort, all the nights I had stayed awake worrying about them, all the moments I had put their happiness above my own. In the following days, the rejection became more pronounced. Emily began inviting friends over for social gatherings in our home, subtly emphasizing the differences in lifestyle and possessions. Michael started openly criticizing the meals I prepared, suggesting alternatives that were expensive or extravagant. Sophie, though quieter, began withdrawing, spending more time in her room with her sketchbooks, avoiding family interactions altogether. The household, once filled with warmth and laughter, now echoed with judgment, subtle hostility, and an unspoken message. "You are not enough unless you are wealthy." One evening, I attempted to have a heart-to-heart conversation with Emily. I wanted her to understand the depth of my feelings, the sacrifices I had made, and the love that had never wavered. "Emily," I said gently, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, "I know you want comfort and stability, and I respect that. But I need you to understand that I have done everything in my power to give you a life filled with love, guidance, and support. My financial situation does not diminish my love or my commitment to you." She looked at me, her eyes filled with frustration and something I couldn't quite identify. Perhaps entitlement, perhaps impatience, perhaps disbelief. "Mom," she said sharply, "I'm not saying you don't love us. I'm saying that love doesn't give us what we deserve. Don't you get that?" I swallowed hard, tears welling in my eyes. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My children had begun to define their lives, their worth, and their expectations through the lens of money. All my years of teaching, guiding, and nurturing seemed invisible. In their eyes, I was no longer a parent worthy of respect, but a figure defined by a perceived lack of resources. The sense of rejection was suffocating, and I felt an ache in my heart that was impossible to describe. Despite the pain, I refused to retaliate or give up. I knew that reacting with anger or resentment would only widen the gap. Instead, I began documenting my efforts, keeping a quiet record of my sacrifices and contributions, not as proof to present immediately, but as a personal reminder that my dedication had never wavered. I also began to explore ways to demonstrate, subtly and without confrontation, that my value as a parent and as an individual was not measured by their perceptions. I wanted them to see eventually that character, integrity, and love were far more significant than money. During this period, I noticed small cracks in their facade of judgment. Sophie, despite her quiet withdrawal, occasionally sought my counsel on personal matters. Michael, in moments of privacy, sometimes showed concern for my well-being. Emily, however, remained the most resistant, her perspective shaped by her fiancé and social influences. It was clear that the battle for recognition and respect would not be won quickly. It would require patience, strategic empathy, and unwavering commitment to the principles I had lived by for decades. As the weeks turned into months, the tension in our household remained palpable. I continued to nurture my children, provide guidance, and maintain an environment of love, even as their rejection persisted. I learned to accept the painful truth that sometimes, even the ones we love most deeply may not immediately recognize or appreciate our sacrifices. And yet, I held on to hope that one day they would understand that my devotion was never about wealth, but about love. Hope that one day the bond we had built over decades would prove stronger than their assumptions and judgments. And so, life continued, each day a test of patience, resilience, and faith. I learned to navigate the delicate balance of maintaining dignity while being present for my children, even as they seemed to push me away. I learned that rejection, though painful, was not the end of the story, and I held on to the belief that love, when rooted in authenticity and sacrifice, has a way of breaking through even the thickest walls of misunderstanding. Little did I know the events that were about to unfold would push our family to the brink. Secrets, revelations, and unexpected twists awaited, moments that would test not only our relationships, but our understanding of trust, loyalty, and the true meaning of love. The journey was far from over, and the hardest lessons were still to come. The next few months were the hardest I had ever endured in my life. Every interaction with my children felt like walking through a minefield, where a single misstep could trigger criticism, disdain, or outright rejection. I had raised these children with unwavering love, sacrificed my own comfort and happiness for their well-being, and yet, in what I began to understand as the cruelest twist of fate, they were judging me not by my character or my devotion, but by my perceived financial standing. Emily's attitude, in particular, became increasingly aggressive. She no longer merely dismissed my advice or complained about my household management. She actively questioned my decisions, often in front of others. Her fiancé, emboldened by her perspective, began subtly undermining me as well. During one dinner party, he commented on the modestness of our home with a forced smile, saying, "It's quaint, but I imagine you're used to simpler living." Emily laughed nervously, and I forced a polite smile, though inside I felt a surge of shame, not because I was lacking, but because my children had allowed themselves to be influenced to see me as less than I was. Michael and Sophie, too, were no longer the children I knew. Michael, once quiet and thoughtful, now spoke with impatience, often questioning my judgment and reminding me of my limitations, in subtle ways. Sophie, my sensitive dreamer, began to avoid me entirely, retreating to her sketches or headphones, immersing herself in a world where she didn't have to confront the growing rift between us. The warmth and connection that had once defined our home had been replaced by cold distance and tension. It all came to a head one evening when I received a note slipped under my bedroom door. It was from Emily. "Mom, We've discussed it and decided that it's better if you stay elsewhere for a while. You can come back when things are more suitable. We love you, but we need space." I stared at the paper, trembling, feeling a deep ache that words cannot describe. The children I had nurtured, loved, and sacrificed for had now pushed me away. The very foundation of my family, the home I had built with care and dedication, felt as though it had crumbled beneath my feet. I sat quietly for hours, reflecting on how it had come to this. Had I failed as a parent? Had my focus on love over material wealth blinded me to the realities that would eventually shape their perception? I knew I had given them everything a parent could offer: guidance, protection, and unwavering support, and yet in their eyes none of it mattered because it wasn't wrapped in a monetary value. The next morning, I tried to address the situation calmly. I approached Emily and Michael, attempting to speak with reason and love. "I understand that you may want independence, but this isn't the solution. I am your parent, and I have spent my life raising you with love. Please, let's discuss this calmly." Emily's response was cold. "Mom, we're not questioning your love. We're saying that your approach to life doesn't fit with ours. We need to focus on our own paths, and frankly, your presence is restrictive. It's better if we have space to build our own lives without being constrained." Michael nodded in agreement, his voice lacking the warmth I remembered from years past. Sophie, still silent, avoided my gaze, as if her agreement or disagreement were irrelevant compared to the need for detachment. It was in that moment I realized that their rejection was not just emotional, it was practical. They were making decisions that affected my living arrangements, my daily life, and my sense of belonging. I felt a surge of helplessness, but also an undercurrent of resolve. If they believed I was unworthy because of perceived financial limitations, then I would need to demonstrate my worth in a way that was undeniable. Not with anger, not with confrontation, but with evidence of my capability and resilience. I moved out temporarily, staying with a friend who offered support without judgment. The first nights were the hardest. I felt an emptiness in my home, an absence that echoed in every room, every object, every memory. The laughter of my children, the warmth of shared meals, the simple joy of being together, all had been replaced by silence, rejection, and a painful sense of invisibility. During this period of separation, I began to reflect deeply on my life. I thought about every sacrifice I had made, the jobs I had taken to pay for their education, the nights I had spent awake worrying about their futures, the countless hours spent cooking, cleaning, and caring while never asking for recognition. I remembered the times I had gone without meals to ensure they were fed, the holidays I had spent working to make theirs memorable, and the small gestures of love I had assumed would speak louder than words. And yet all of it had been overshadowed by a perception that equated my value with money. I realized that while their rejection was painful, it also offered a lesson, that love alone, no matter how deep or unwavering, is sometimes insufficient to bridge misunderstandings or to counter societal pressures and material obsessions. I needed to be patient, strategic, and resilient, but I also needed to acknowledge the reality that my children's perspectives had been influenced by external factors, their peers, social media, and the subtle pressures of comparison and materialism. Despite the emotional turmoil, I refused to succumb to despair. I focused on my own well-being, ensuring that I remained healthy, alert, and capable. I sought support from friends who understood my situation, drawing strength from their encouragement. I also began quietly planning ways to demonstrate my worth and resilience, not in a confrontational manner, but through actions that would speak louder than words. It was during this time that I discovered opportunities I had never considered before. Freelance projects, small investments, and ventures that leveraged my experience and skills became a source of not just financial gain, but also personal empowerment. I realized that while my children may have doubted me, I still possessed the ability to provide, to grow, and to thrive. The discovery was invigorating, reminding me that value is not dictated by perception, but by action, knowledge, and determination. As months passed, I maintained minimal contact with my children, respecting their stated need for space, yet always remaining available for guidance or support if they sought it. Emily occasionally sent curt messages about logistical matters. Michael inquired about household expenses, and Sophie, still hesitant, reached out for advice on school projects. Each interaction was cautious, measured, and tinged with an underlying tension, but it was also a reminder that despite the rejection, the bonds of family had not been entirely severed. I also began reflecting on the subtle ways in which my children's perceptions had been shaped. Emily's fiancé had a considerable influence, often framing decisions in terms of status and financial security. Michael's social circles reinforced the importance of wealth and material accomplishment, while Sophie, though sensitive and artistic, was beginning to internalize the societal pressures around her. I realized that their rejection was not purely personal. It was a manifestation of broader influences, a convergence of societal expectations, peer pressure, and generational misunderstanding. In quiet moments, I would imagine conversations that could bridge the gap, dialogues that could allow my children to see beyond the surface, to understand the depth of my sacrifices, and to recognize the value of love, integrity, and resilience. I envisioned moments where we could reconcile, not through financial demonstration, but through emotional honesty and authentic connection. These imagined dialogues became a source of hope, reminding me that while the path ahead was fraught with challenges, it was not impossible to navigate. And then came the subtle hints that the tide might be turning. Sophie, despite her reticence, began leaving small notes, expressing gratitude for past guidance, acknowledging my support in moments I had assumed were unnoticed. Michael, in a rare private conversation, mentioned the lessons I had taught him about responsibility and perseverance, even if he did not yet fully appreciate the extent of my efforts. Emily remained the most resistant, but even she showed fleeting moments of hesitation, small cracks in her confident dismissal that hinted at the potential for reconciliation. It became clear that the journey ahead would not be about immediate vindication or confrontation. It would require patience, consistent demonstration of value, and unwavering emotional presence. I knew that the road to mending these fractured relationships would be long, filled with both setbacks and small victories. I also knew that my resolve, my experience, and my enduring love would serve as the foundation for this journey. As I prepared to re-enter the household in a measured, strategic manner, I reflected on the lessons of the past months. I had learned that rejection, while painful, can serve as a catalyst for growth, introspection, and resilience. I had discovered new strengths within myself, opportunities that had previously been unnoticed, and a renewed sense of purpose that extended beyond the immediate pain. Most importantly, I had reaffirmed my commitment to my children, not in terms of material provision, but through unwavering love, guidance, and the steadfast demonstration of character. Little did I know, the coming months would bring moments of revelation that would test my patience, challenge my ingenuity, and ultimately redefine the relationships I had fought so hard to preserve. The stage was set for confrontation, revelation, and the eventual recognition that love, integrity, and perseverance can endure even the harshest judgments and the deepest misunderstandings. Returning to the home I had built for my family felt surreal. The familiar walls, once full of laughter and warmth, now seemed like silent witnesses to the fracture that had formed between us. The furniture, the meals, the everyday routines, all remained the same, yet the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer a haven of unconditional love. It had become a landscape of judgment, misunderstanding, and distance. I walked through the house carefully, mindful of every step, every movement, every word I spoke. My goal was clear. I had to reclaim not just my place in the home, but, more importantly, the respect and understanding of my children. I began quietly observing their behaviors, noting the subtle dynamics that had emerged. Emily, always outspoken, had taken control of much of the household decision-making, She dictated schedules, meals, and even interactions with me, as if to remind me of my supposed inadequacy. Michael, analytical and precise, scrutinized every financial choice I made, offering suggestions that were veiled criticisms of my judgment. Sophie, still sensitive and retreating, avoided conflict, yet I sensed she was quietly absorbing everything, processing the tension with the perceptive mind that had always been her strength. It was clear that any attempt at confrontation or direct explanation would meet resistance. Instead, I needed a strategy that would allow my children to witness my worth firsthand, to recognize the depth of my sacrifices, and to understand that my value was not defined by their assumptions. I decided to approach this subtly through a combination of action, patience, and emotional intelligence. First, I focused on rebuilding trust and connection. I resumed small household routines that had previously been sources of comfort and bonding. I prepared their favorite meals, not as an obligation, but as a quiet demonstration of care. I left notes of encouragement on their desks and in their rooms, praising their efforts in school, work, and personal projects. I engaged Sophie in art projects, Michael in analytical tasks, and even found moments to share experiences with Emily that did not involve confrontation, but subtly reminded her of our shared history and my enduring support. At the same time, I began enhancing my own independence and capability. I took on freelance work that leveraged my expertise, worked on small projects that allowed me to generate income quietly, and made financial decisions that improved my position without making it overtly visible. This was not for the purpose of proving a point immediately, but to create a foundation of stability that could be revealed at the right moment, demonstrating that my perceived poverty was a misconception and that my worth extended far beyond their narrow view. I also began to engage in self-reflection and personal growth, understanding that my children's perceptions were influenced not just by material expectations, but also by societal norms, peer pressures, and generational differences. I recognized that anger or resentment toward them would not serve me. Instead, patience, empathy, and measured action would be my most powerful tools. I meditated on the years of sacrifices I had made, reminding myself that while their recognition was desired, it was not necessary for me to validate my own life or choices. The first breakthrough came unexpectedly. Sophie, who had been withdrawn for months, approached me one afternoon with a sketchbook in hand. "Mom," she said softly, "I wanted you to see what I've been working on. You always encouraged me to follow my dreams." I took the book, and as I examined her intricate drawings, I felt a wave of warmth and hope. Here was a small connection, a sign that despite the tension, my influence and love were not forgotten. I praised her work sincerely, and for the first time in months, I felt her eyes meet mine with something approaching trust and admiration. Encouraged by this moment, I turned my attention to Michael. I noticed that while he often criticized my financial decisions, he also sought my advice when faced with complex problems, particularly in budgeting and planning. I began to offer guidance discreetly, providing insights that allowed him to succeed in ways he had not anticipated. Slowly, subtly, he began to recognize the practical value of my experience, even if he had not yet acknowledged the emotional sacrifices I had made. Emily remained the most resistant. Her attitude continued to reflect the influence of her fiancé and her social circles, and she remained focused on material measures of success. Yet even here, small cracks began to appear. During one argument over household expenses, I calmly outlined a plan that allowed her to have some desired comforts while maintaining financial stability for the household. Her initial reaction was dismissal, but over the following days, I noticed that she followed my plan without complaint. It was a small victory, but it demonstrated that action often speaks louder than words, and that even the most resistant attitudes can be influenced by competent, calm, and effective guidance. As weeks turned into months, my quiet plan began to take shape. I maintained emotional distance where necessary, yet remained actively involved in their lives. I demonstrated patience, understanding, and competence in every interaction. I celebrated small victories, Sophie seeking my advice, Michael following my guidance, Emily adhering to household plans, with quiet satisfaction, knowing that these moments were building the foundation for a larger, more significant revelation. It was also during this period that I began to document my contributions, not for immediate confrontation, but as a personal reminder of my dedication and sacrifices. I kept records of the jobs I had taken, the hours I had worked, the financial and emotional support I had provided, and the countless small acts of love that often went unnoticed. This documentation was not intended as a weapon against my children, but as a testament to the life I had built, the love I had given, and the resilience I had shown in the face of rejection. In addition to practical and emotional strategies, I focused on creating opportunities for reflection. I shared stories from my own life, lessons about resilience, integrity, and the value of perseverance. I did not frame these as lectures but as narratives, hoping that over time, my children would internalize the lessons naturally. I spoke about my own struggles, the sacrifices I had made quietly, and the challenges I had faced, not as a way to elicit sympathy, but to provide context and insight into the values I had tried to instill. Turning point came when an unexpected challenge arose. A sudden household expense required immediate attention, a minor repair that had been delayed due to budget constraints. Emily panicked, convinced that we lacked the resources to address it, and suggested postponing the repair indefinitely. I calmly assessed the situation, arranged for the necessary funds discreetly, and ensured the work was completed efficiently and effectively. The children witnessed the resolution, and while Emily did not immediately acknowledge it, the impact was visible. Michael began asking for advice on similar situations. Sophie expressed relief and gratitude, and Emily, though silent, began to reconsider her assumptions about my capability and resourcefulness. Through these small, deliberate actions, I began to rebuild the foundation of respect, trust, and recognition. I learned that transformation often comes slowly, through consistent demonstration of competence, love, and integrity. I realized that while my children's initial rejection had been painful, it had also created an opportunity for growth. For both them and me, it forced me to clarify my values, strengthen my resolve, and approach the challenge of rebuilding our family with intentionality and strategy. I also discovered the importance of emotional intelligence in navigating conflict. By observing my children's behaviors, understanding their motivations, and responding with patience and empathy, I was able to diffuse potential confrontations before they escalated. I learned to choose my battles wisely, to focus on meaningful interventions rather than reacting to every slight, and to create environments where my children could witness my competence without feeling threatened or challenged. As the months progressed, small but significant changes became evident. Sophie began seeking my input more frequently, showing confidence in my guidance. Michael displayed respect for my judgment, acknowledging my experience in subtle but meaningful ways. Emily remained cautious, but cracks in her resistance were appearing, particularly when she observed the consistency, calm, and effectiveness of my approach in action. It became clear that my quiet plan was working, not through confrontation, not through demands or ultimatums, but through patience, competence, and unwavering demonstration of value. The children were beginning to recognize that my worth was not defined by their assumptions, that my sacrifices and guidance had been significant, and that the foundation of love and support I had built over decades was not easily dismissed. In the quiet moments, I reflected on the lessons I had learned. I realized that parental love, while powerful, is sometimes challenged by external influences, misperceptions, and the pressures of societal values. I understood that patience, strategic action, and consistent demonstration of competence are essential tools in navigating these challenges. Most importantly, I reaffirmed my commitment to my children, not as a reaction to rejection, but as an enduring expression of love, guidance, and dedication. The stage was now set for the next phase of our journey. The groundwork had been laid, respect and trust were slowly being rebuilt, and the subtle shifts in perception hinted at a potential for reconciliation. Yet challenges remained, particularly with Emily, whose resistance continued to test my patience and strategy. The coming months would require careful planning, emotional fortitude, and a balance of subtlety and action to achieve the recognition and respect that had long been denied. Little did I know, the events on the horizon would not only challenge my ability to influence and guide, but would also reveal truths that would shock, inspire, and ultimately redefine the dynamics of our family. The quiet plan was in motion, and the next steps would determine whether decades of love and sacrifice could withstand the trials of misunderstanding, judgment, and perceived inadequacy. The weeks that followed marked the beginning of a subtle yet powerful transformation. My presence in the home, once resented and dismissed, began to shift from being a source of tension to a quiet, undeniable influence. It was not immediate, nor was it dramatic, but in the small actions, the careful decisions, and the consistent demonstrations of competence and care, my children began to glimpse a truth they had long refused to acknowledge, that my worth extended far beyond their assumptions, beyond their narrow judgments, and beyond the material measures they had so eagerly embraced. It started with the day-to-day management of the household. Emily, still cautious and resistant, had been taking charge of scheduling and expenses, often with a critical eye toward my perceived limitations. Yet time and again, she encountered challenges that required immediate, practical solutions: repairs, budgeting conflicts, scheduling conflicts, or unexpected issues. Each time, I stepped in calmly and efficiently, providing solutions that resolved the problems without fanfare or confrontation. I noticed Emily watching, her brows knitting, subtle signs of surprise flickering across her face when her assumptions of incompetence proved false. Michael, analytical and precise, began to rely on my guidance more frequently. He sought my input on decisions that once would have been made independently, often asking questions about strategy, logistics, or planning. The respect that had been missing in previous months began to return incrementally, though he was careful not to show it openly. His reliance on my experience was a small victory, a sign that the quiet plan of demonstrating value through action was beginning to resonate. Sophie, my sensitive dreamer, continued to blossom quietly. She would approach me with questions about her projects, seeking advice, reassurance, and perspective. Her earlier withdrawal began to fade, replaced by a willingness to share her thoughts and seek guidance. Each of these interactions, though seemingly minor, was a crucial step in rebuilding the emotional bridge that had been strained by months of rejection. The first significant turning point occurred one evening when Emily approached me with an unexpected request. She had encountered a challenge with her fiancé's family regarding financial planning for their upcoming wedding. "Mom," she said hesitantly, I need your advice. I know I haven't always listened, but I could really use your perspective." My heart swelled with a mixture of pride and cautious optimism. This was the first time she had actively sought my guidance without resistance, and it signaled the beginning of a potential reconciliation. I approached the situation carefully, offering guidance without judgment, emphasizing practical solutions while subtly reminding her of the years of experience and knowledge I had accumulated. Over the following days, I watched as she implemented my advice, navigating complex arrangements with a new understanding of the value of my input. It was a small victory, but it carried profound significance. The walls of judgment were beginning to crack, and the seeds of recognition were taking root. At the same time, Michael and Sophie continued to demonstrate subtle shifts in their attitudes. Michael, once quick to critique, began acknowledging my insights with quiet appreciation. Sophie, more confident and expressive, shared her successes with me openly, seeking validation not out of need but out of genuine trust. These incremental changes were heartening, yet I knew the most significant challenge remained: Emily's perception, heavily influenced by her fiancé and social expectations, required a more deliberate and carefully orchestrated approach. I began to consider ways to demonstrate my value in a manner that was both undeniable and respectful. It was not enough to rely solely on day-to-day competence. I needed a moment, a situation that would reveal the depth of my capabilities, the extent of my sacrifices, and the reality of my worth. The opportunity arrived sooner than I anticipated, in the form of an unexpected family emergency. A sudden medical issue arose, an urgent situation that required immediate action and precise coordination. Emily and her fiancé were initially paralyzed by the stress, unsure of how to proceed. Michael, though analytical, lacked experience in managing the logistics under pressure. Sophie, overwhelmed, retreated in anxiety. I stepped in without hesitation, coordinating medical care, arranging transportation, managing paperwork, and providing emotional support to each of them. My calm demeanor, decisive actions, and ability to handle the crisis effectively left them momentarily speechless. It was in the aftermath of this emergency that the first cracks in Emily's resistance became evident. She looked at me with a mixture of awe and realization, the subtle acknowledgement that the parent she had dismissed as incapable was in fact profoundly competent and resourceful. Michael, too, expressed gratitude in a way that was not hidden behind analytical discussion, but heartfelt and genuine. Sophie, visibly relieved and comforted, clung to me in an embrace that spoke volumes about the renewed trust between us. This event marked a turning point. The children could no longer ignore the tangible evidence of my capabilities, nor could they dismiss the decades of dedication and sacrifice that had built the foundation for such moments of resilience. The perception of poverty, of inadequacy, of incompetence had been challenged not by argument or confrontation, but by action, presence, and unwavering love. I continued to build on this momentum, integrating subtle demonstrations of skill, wisdom, and emotional support into daily interactions. I managed household finances with precision, providing insights that optimized budgeting and savings. I assisted in planning important events, offering guidance that was practical, insightful, and considerate. I nurtured emotional growth, listening attentively to concerns, providing comfort, and celebrating achievements. Each action reinforced the narrative of competence, love, and unwavering dedication, slowly reshaping the children's perceptions. Emily's transformation, though gradual, became increasingly evident. She began consulting me on decisions, openly seeking my advice, and incorporating my suggestions into her plans. Michael, already analytical and observant, started to recognize patterns of wisdom and foresight in my guidance, acknowledging my contributions with subtle appreciation. Sophie, ever sensitive and perceptive, demonstrated a renewed willingness to engage, seeking emotional support and sharing her successes openly. The shift was not without its challenges. Moments of tension and resistance still arose, particularly when Emily's fiancé subtly attempted to reassert influence over her decisions. Yet by maintaining calm, strategic action, and consistent demonstrations of value, I was able to navigate these challenges effectively, reinforcing the credibility and authority I had gradually restored. It was during one quiet evening after resolving a particularly complex household issue that Emily approached me privately. Her voice was softer than I had heard in months, tinged with a vulnerability that had previously been absent. "Mom," she said hesitantly, I've been unfair. I didn't understand and I judged too quickly. I see now that you've always done more than I realized." The words, simple yet profound, struck me deeply. It was the acknowledgement I had hoped for, the first verbal recognition that my efforts, sacrifices, and love had not gone unnoticed. The emotional impact of this moment was profound, yet I remained measured. I embraced Emily, offering love and reassurance, but I also recognized that reconciliation is a process, not a single event. I continued to nurture trust, provide guidance, and demonstrate value in both subtle and tangible ways, ensuring that the foundation being rebuilt was strong, resilient, and enduring. Michael and Sophie, witnessing this moment, also displayed visible signs of recognition and appreciation. Michael offered a quiet, sincere acknowledgement of my guidance and contributions, while Sophie expressed heartfelt gratitude for the emotional support and encouragement she had received. The family dynamic, though not yet fully restored, had begun to shift in a positive direction. As the days progressed, the home became increasingly filled with warmth, cooperation, and subtle recognition. Conflicts still arose, but they were approached with greater empathy, patience, and understanding. The children's perspectives were evolving, influenced not by confrontation or argument, but by consistent demonstration of capability, love, and unwavering commitment. It became clear that the journey of rebuilding trust and respect was ongoing, yet the progress achieved thus far was undeniable. The perception of inadequacy, which had fueled rejection and tension, was gradually being replaced by recognition, appreciation, and renewed connection. The quiet plan, executed with patience, intelligence, and emotional insight, was proving effective. I reflected on the lessons of these months, that true value is revealed through consistent action, not argument, that love, patience, and strategic guidance can overcome assumptions and judgments, and that even in the face of rejection, perseverance and integrity can restore respect and trust. The foundation I had built over decades, through sacrifice, care, and dedication, was resilient, and now it was beginning to bear fruit. The stage was set for the next phase: deeper revelations, more profound confrontations, and a full acknowledgement of the truths that had long been overlooked. The children had begun to see, not just through words, but through actions, the magnitude of my contributions, the depth of my love, and the enduring strength of my character. The journey was far from complete, but the path ahead was illuminated by the small victories, subtle shifts, and growing recognition that even the harshest judgments can be softened by patience, competence, and unwavering love. The days following the initial recognition of my efforts were a delicate balance of hope and tension. While Emily, Michael, and Sophie had begun to show signs of acknowledgement and appreciation, the air remained heavy with the remnants of past misunderstandings. It was clear to me that superficial changes were not enough. For the wounds to truly heal, the truth needed to unfold completely, in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. I began to reflect deeply on the events that had led to this rift. I thought about my decades of sacrifice, the countless hours I had spent working silently to ensure my children never wanted for anything, and the moments of joy I had derived from seeing their smiles, their achievements, and their growth. I realized that while my children had witnessed these efforts in fragments, they had never been given the full context, the scope, the depth, and the consistency of my love and labor. It was time for that truth to come to light. But I understood that a direct confrontation or a detailed explanation would likely be met with resistance or disbelief. Instead, I needed a method that allowed them to see the reality of my life, my work, and my dedication organically, through evidence and experience rather than argument. I began carefully planning ways to reveal this truth, focusing on transparency, patience, and the subtle demonstration of long, hidden contributions. The first opportunity arose unexpectedly. While helping Michael organize some financial documents, I discovered records of the various jobs, freelance projects, and community work I had undertaken quietly over the years. These were documents he had never seen, evidence of the countless hours I had spent ensuring the family's stability. I carefully reviewed them, realizing that their content, when presented thoughtfully, could challenge the assumptions that had fueled so much rejection. One evening, I gathered the children in the living room under the pretense of a routine family discussion. I began by asking them to review some old documents with me: financial records, letters from employers, and receipts from charitable work. Initially, they were skeptical, their expressions guarded. Emily raised an eyebrow, Michael folded his arms, and Sophie, quiet but curious, leaned in slightly. As I walked them through the records, explaining each entry with calm clarity, a transformation began to take place. They saw the scope of my work, the late nights, the extra shifts, the freelance projects taken to ensure they had educational opportunities. the meticulous budgeting that had prevented crises they were never aware of. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of dedication and resourcefulness that had gone unnoticed, not because it was absent, but because it had been quiet, consistent, and selfless. Emily's initial skepticism began to falter. She glanced at her siblings, then back at me, her expression softening. I didn't realize, she murmured, almost to herself. Michael's analytical mind processed the data silently, and for the first time he nodded in acknowledgement, a quiet recognition of the accuracy, effort, and foresight that had guided every decision I had made. Sophie, overwhelmed, whispered a simple "Mom, I didn't know," her voice trembling with emotion. The emotional weight of this moment was profound. For years, assumptions and misjudgments had clouded their perceptions, yet here, in black and white, was undeniable proof of my sacrifices and competence. The narrative that I was incapable or poor in value was being dismantled, not through argument or confrontation, but through evidence and transparency. Over the next several days, the household atmosphere began to shift. Emily, who had once been dismissive and judgmental, started seeking my advice more earnestly. She asked questions about managing her wedding budget, organizing her future household, and planning her career moves. Each inquiry was a subtle acknowledgement of my expertise and experience, and each answer I provided reinforced the truth they were finally beginning to see. Michael, previously skeptical, became more collaborative. He approached me with questions about investments, budgeting strategies, and household planning, often referencing the documents I had presented. Sophie, inspired by the clarity and honesty of the discussion, began to share her creative projects openly, seeking guidance and validation. The walls of judgment and misperception that had once divided us were slowly giving way to understanding, connection, and mutual respect. Yet the journey was far from complete. While the evidence had challenged their assumptions, emotional wounds ran deep. Past rejection, harsh words, and months of distance could not be erased instantly. I realized that reconciliation required not just proof, but also ongoing emotional engagement, empathy, and patience. I committed to providing consistent support, demonstrating care, and fostering trust through both words and actions. The next pivotal moment arrived during a family meeting that Emily herself initiated. She asked me to join her and her fiancé in discussing wedding plans, seeking my input on budget allocation, vendor selection, and logistics. This was a significant step, the first time she had actively included me in a major decision without resistance or subtle dismissal. I approached the conversation with calm professionalism, offering guidance, insights, and practical solutions. My contributions were met with genuine appreciation, a stark contrast to the dismissal I had endured months prior. As the meeting progressed, Emily began to reflect aloud. "Mom, I realize now that I judged you too quickly," she admitted, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "I didn't understand the work, the effort, and the sacrifices you've made. I see now that you've always been capable, resourceful, and incredibly dedicated." Michael nodded in agreement, adding, "We underestimated everything you've done. Seeing the evidence, the records, it's clear now how much you've managed and sacrificed for us." Sophie, still emotional, embraced me quietly, whispering, "Thank you for everything, Mom. I didn't realize before." The relief and emotional release I felt were profound. For years, I had carried the weight of rejection silently, navigating the pain with patience, love, and quiet resilience. Now that weight began to lift, replaced by the affirmation and acknowledgement I had long hoped for. It was a turning point, not just for our family dynamic, but for the healing of emotional wounds that had festered under the shadow of misunderstanding and judgment. In the weeks that followed, the household continued to transform. Emily became more collaborative, respectful, and appreciative of my guidance. Michael, analytical and careful, demonstrated newfound respect for my wisdom and experience. Sophie, emotionally sensitive and perceptive, became more open and communicative. The atmosphere of tension and distance that had characterized our home for months was gradually replaced by warmth, cooperation, and mutual understanding. Yet I knew that the most significant revelations were still to come. Beyond the immediate acknowledgement of my competence and sacrifices, there remained deeper truths to uncover, lessons about resilience, integrity, and the enduring power of love. These revelations would not only solidify the changes in perception, but also strengthen the emotional bonds that had been strained by months of misunderstanding. I began to share stories from my past that I had never spoken about before, the challenges I had faced as a young adult, the obstacles I had overcome to provide for our family, and the moments of quiet triumph that had shaped my character. These narratives, delivered with honesty and emotional depth, provided context and insight that complemented the factual evidence I had already presented. My children listened, sometimes with tears in their eyes, sometimes with reflective silence, absorbing lessons that were both personal and universal. Through these stories, I conveyed the broader truths that had guided my life, that value is measured not by wealth or status, but by integrity, resilience, and the ability to persevere, that love is demonstrated through consistent care, sacrifice, and presence, and that true strength is often quiet, unseen, and unrecognized until tested. My children, now receptive, began to internalize these lessons, understanding not just the facts of my life, but the principles and values that had guided my actions for decades. The process of reconciliation, however, was gradual. While acknowledgement and appreciation had increased significantly, rebuilding trust and repairing emotional bonds required ongoing engagement, empathy, and patience. I continued to demonstrate my commitment through daily actions, supporting their endeavors, providing guidance, and nurturing emotional well-being, while allowing space for reflection, growth, and mutual understanding. One day, as we sat together reviewing wedding plans with Emily, she paused and looked at me with genuine warmth. "Mom, I can't express how much I've learned from all of this, not just about finances or planning, but about life, resilience, and love. I see now how much you've done for us, and I want to make sure we honor that moving forward." Her words were both affirmation and promise, a recognition of the past and a commitment to a more connected future. Michael, observing, added quietly, "I've learned to appreciate the effort, the sacrifices, and the guidance you've provided. I want to be more mindful, more respectful, and more present." Sophie, with tears in her eyes, embraced me, whispering again, "Thank you for never giving up on us, Mom. I see everything now." The emotional impact was profound. For months, I had navigated rejection, judgment, and misunderstanding with patience, resilience, and strategic action. Now, the first fruits of that effort were visible, not just in acknowledgement, but in tangible shifts in attitude, behavior, and emotional connection. The foundation of love, trust, and respect that had been strained was beginning to solidify once more, stronger than before. Yet I knew the journey was not complete. While significant progress had been made, further revelations, challenges, and moments of reflection were necessary to fully restore balance, understanding, and enduring connection. The next phases would involve deeper confrontations with misconceptions, resolution of residual tensions, and the ultimate affirmation of love, integrity, and family unity. The house, once filled with tension and silent judgment, had begun to hum with the faint echoes of possibility. Small gestures of acknowledgement and appreciation had begun to rebuild the bridge between me and my children. But I knew that true reconciliation required a confrontation, a moment where lingering assumptions, misconceptions, and unspoken grievances could finally be addressed openly. It was not a confrontation of anger, but a confrontation of truth, where honesty and clarity would pave the way for lasting understanding. The catalyst arrived unexpectedly one evening. Emily had returned from work, visibly frustrated. She had encountered challenges with her fiancé regarding a joint investment plan, and the discussions had become heated. Michael was trying to mediate, offering logical solutions, while Sophie retreated quietly to her room. Sensing the tension, I approached calmly, knowing this was an opportunity not to assert authority, but to facilitate clarity. "Emily, Michael," I began gently, I can see this situation is causing stress. Let's sit down and review everything carefully. Perhaps we can approach it together and find a solution." Emily looked at me skeptically, her frustration momentarily giving way to curiosity. "Mom, it's complicated. You wouldn't understand," she replied sharply, though her tone carried a hint of hesitation. I smiled softly, acknowledging her words without confrontation. "I may not know all the details yet, but I know how to approach problems logically and calmly. Let's review the facts together, and perhaps I can offer guidance." She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Michael, sensing the potential for resolution, agreed as well. Sophie, quietly observing, returned from her room, signaling that she too wanted to witness this discussion. We gathered around the dining table, papers spread out, calculations made, and options considered. I began to speak calmly, explaining step by step the potential pitfalls and benefits of each choice, offering strategies that balanced risk and reward while considering long-term stability. My voice was steady, measured, and devoid of judgment, simply a reflection of experience and insight. As the discussion progressed,